Hi, I'm Alana,
And I'm Jessie.
and we are making mentions. Tonight is the first part of our October book club series where we're talking about the book A Land with a People, Palestinians and Jews Confront Zionism, which is edited by Esther Farmer, Rosalind Petchke, and Sarah Sills, and has a foreword by Nora Ericat. Do you want to give a quick intro to why we wanted to read it, how we chose to break it up?
Yeah, so we wanted to choose a text that highlighted a combination of voices and in a way that was strictly anti-Zionist leaning, not both sides kind of issue. We'll talk more about JVP's politics in a second, but that's why we wanted to read it. Jewish Voice for Peace has done a lot of interesting work, but that was mainly our focus. And then we chose to break it up basically half and half. Thematically, it's really interesting the way it's broken up, and I'm very interested to see how this conversation goes. But we are starting with a history and displacement and memory, which is up to page 104, of course, including the beginning chapters that we talked about as well. And then the wrestling with identity, questioning power, and repairing and healing sections of the book are going to be next week. And that splits the book in half, but also will bring us through our conversation.
I just want to highlight this was published in 2021, and so it's fairly recent, and I guess I don't know if like all of the pieces in it are as recent. Some of them might be older, but the book as a collection was put together in 2021 and published then. So it is pretty recent, and I think that's just important because I don't think we can give any of the caveats of like, well, this was a few years ago and maybe things have changed.
Sure.
We wanted to highlight before diving into the book that there are so many books written by Palestinian authors that we absolutely could have explored instead, and really just chose this book for the reasons that Jessie stated, is that it was recent. We had both seen it around the interwebs and groups that we were in, and we're just curious to explore it a bit and start here. But with that being said, we do want to acknowledge that there have been a few Palestinian creators and activists who have highlighted some of JVP's issues, specifically on Instagram,
Nadine, yeah.
whose Instagram is at NERDEENK. There's a whole highlight on Nerdine's page about JVP, and the gist of it, which I will sum up here, is just that in general on social media, JVP has sort of ignored a lot of Palestinian requests for JVP to reshare posts about rallies or other information, and has chosen to create their own posts about different rallies or events or information about hunger strikes, and post it sort of on their own timeline instead of just reposting Palestinian voices who are already sharing this information. Also, critiques of JVP not being super quick to update their statistics to be accurate when they have paid social media staff versus Palestinian pages who are not paid and do this for survival and are able to keep them updated. And one of the final points that they mention is that one of the co-founders of JVP and a previous executive director no longer works with JVP, to my understanding, was married to someone who worked for Checkpoint, which is an Israeli cybersecurity company that makes monitoring software. And she basically never disclosed this, which, you know, people can have private lives, but when you are a co-founder and executive director of an organization that proclaims to be anti-Zionist, talking publicly about the fact that the person you are married to is involved in Israeli surveillance is kind of a big deal. So yeah, like Nerdine said, no one was asking Rebecca Vilker Vilkomerson. No one was asking Rebecca to divorce her husband, but definitely a disclosure and acknowledgement of that like very stark dichotomy probably should have existed. And so we just wanted to highlight that. We still read the book. We're still talking about the book. So here we are, but important just to make note of the realities that everything is layered and complex.
Yeah, I also want to just throw in there too, even the concept of having Jewish Voice for Peace and centering Jewish feelings in the context of Palestinian struggle for land back and resistance against Israeli occupation and genocide is a core issue with JVP. And I struggle with it too, and it'll come up again in our conversation. But JVP at its core, I don't know how I feel about having a Jewish arm of the Palestinian movement or all the things that come up through that. So in its practice, but also in the founding, is an interesting kind of struggle. Also, I don't think they use the term genocide in any of their content. They use mostly apartheid and occupation and settlements. So that has been a push, I know, from groups like Within Our Lifetime, to be like, say genocide, say it.
Yeah. And I do think that within this book, there are parts that absolutely use the language of genocide and ethnic cleansing. But again, this is a collection of stories from a variety of folks, not all of which are actually part of JVP. And yeah, that doesn't necessarily show up on JVP's media. I wanted to spend like a few moments just talking about what the benefits of a textus are, because I feel like we're like, this is not great, but I think that it's important for us to allow room for contradiction to exist and for the acknowledgement that most of the American Jewish community, especially the community that Jesse and I grew up in and interact in, is not even at a point where they could read this book and digest it and not think that they were being personally attacked. And so I think that I really struggle with this because one side of me is very much, yeah, right, exactly like you said, Jesse. What is even the point of JVP when there are Palestinian organizations doing this organizing? What is the necessity of a Jewish arm in this work? What does it mean for this book to have to be written where it's like this combination of Jewish and Palestinian sources that sort of allows for Palestinian stories to be told because it's in this context? But the other half of me is like, I still have learning to do as I go as an anti-Zionist Jew, and I learned a lot from this book, frankly. And I think that there are so many Jews, especially in the United States, especially Ashkenazic Jews, that need this information and need it to come from other Jews to sort of validate the fact that they can exist in the world as an anti-Zionist Jew. And so, yeah, just letting that breathe and be what it is, because I don't have a resolution to any of those things, but I just do think that it can be important for this to exist, and we can acknowledge that in an ideal world, we would just be listening to people who are currently experiencing a genocide, which is Palestinian voices. But yeah, we're all wrapped up in this.
Absolutely. That was really well said. Yeah. And I think that the growth only comes from being in the struggle and the uncomfortable. And I would never want someone to refuse to be a part of this or stay away from it because they think they have to be a perfect activist. And you show up as you are, and we work on it. So I think I'm grateful for pieces like this that show us how to just show up as we are and let it be messy.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into it. So we're starting with the first section, which is very long, which is on history. I think, what is it called? Zionism's Twilight.
Yes.
Yes, Zionism's Twilight, Colonial Dreams, Racist Nightmares, and Liberated Futures by Rosalind Petchke. I feel like we could have done an entire session just on this section in particular. Like, there was so much in it. But yeah, let's just jump in. We wanted to start with things that we learned in this section, things that were fully new to us. And in this section, we're also including the foreword and the preface. Just want to highlight that. Do you want to like, kick us off, Jesse?
Yes. So I love that right off of the bat in the foreword by Nura Erakat, we're talking about the joint struggle against colonialism. And I think even in it, the author says that it wasn't named as intersectionality, but it was intersectionality, that on college campuses, that Black student unions and Latinx groups and all of these other groups that were marginalized by colonization of their home countries and battling colonialism were united in the struggle for a free Palestine in a way that honestly a lot of Jews couldn't get behind until later. So I really liked that point, and made so early on, I thought was really important. I also wanted to jump to the fact that the quote, "a land without a people," which has been used to describe Palestine, is not invented by Zionists. It's like co-opted by Zionists from a Christian saying. And I have to do more research into that, but I just love that it's not even original. It's just like ripped from someone else's thing. And those were two really big parts of starting this off. I was like, strong. I don't know any of that. Oh, and that was from the preface with Esther Farmer. That was just some really key moments and just in the first couple pages.
I thought that was also fascinating, and it I think that's just such a funny plate. Not funny because it's not funny. But the fact that, and again, I also didn't look into this, but I also was like, oh, I didn't know that. And for even this key saying to Zionism to be appropriated from a Christian saying is just so reminiscent of the ways in which Zionism was and continues to be stirred by Christianity and whiteness and Eurocentricness, and just a very unsurprising surprise.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes along with the next thing that was a fascinating fact and horrifying, but the forced sterilization of Ethiopian immigrants to Israel with the experimental drug that they eventually stopped using was, of course, not surprising at all to me about, the Israel's treatment of Ethiopian Jews and African refugees to Israel regardless, but definitely was new information to me and really stuck with me in terms of like the deliberateness of genocide, even the undesirables, as they say, amongst our own people. I think that was really interesting. That was from Zionism's Twilight, which is the beginning of the history section that we talked about.
Yeah, I had also flagged that because as soon as I read that, it's just, I mean, obviously we know that all colonial practice is so similar in so many ways, but there's so many elements of Israeli colonization that freely mirror US colonization. And I was immediately reminded during that part of, I'm just looking for the page that's on, of US sterilization of Latina women in I guess the later part of the 20th century, but it has gone on for a very long time. Again, specifically using Depo-Provera shot, which was tested on Latinx women in the United States and ended in obviously forced and coerced sterilization. And that's how we sort of figured out that Depo-Provera was really not the move and really, really, really bad for people with uteruses. So it's just fascinating that the exact same method was replicated in Palestine or, by Israelis on Palestinian women. So yeah, that really stood out to me as well.
Yeah, horrifying. And in the vein of all things horrifying, because it's just the historical portion, so of course it's horrifying. I think what
Petchke? I don't know.
Okay. Zionism Twilight history section focusing on the intentional maiming of Palestinians during the attacks on Palestinian villages and communities, not to kill Palestinians, but the intentional making people amputees and disabling and maiming Palestinians to reject the notion of intentional genocide, but then they can just say Israeli soldiers or police or whatever, oh no, we just beat them up, or we just shot them once, or it wasn't intentional, it was an accident that now they're disabled for life, or they're in a wheelchair, or they're missing eyes and legs and hands, and just the horrific concept that is intentional so that Israel can avoid the label of genocide. I think that was, newly shocking to me. Not the concept of maiming people, but just that it could be so planned, or to avoid accountability seemed so sinister to me.
Yeah, and that sort of ties into something. I just want to highlight all of that is on, I think, page 30 of this section if you're reading the book, both the information on the contraception, sterilization, and the information on the intentional maiming of Palestinians. But yeah, it just leads me to another thing that really stood out to me in the history section, which was this, I guess, connection or clear overlap between Zionism and racism, and Zionism being at its core racism, which is what Edward Said talked about when he talked about Palestine. But it's really laid out in such very specific ways that from the very beginning of genocide until today and continuing today, there have been such clear examples of racism and of the desire for Israel to be a state for white Ashkenazi Jews and no one else. And it wasn't just, this is a place for Jews. It's like, this is a place for white Ashkenazi Jews. And right, like with the sterilization of Ethiopian immigrants, and with the ways that I think someone uses the term, they wanted to de-Arabize Israel, regardless of the fact that Arab Jews have always existed, was just like, yeah, like it makes perfect sense, but it's laid out in a way that I thought was really digestible and like helpful to understand. Also, this idea of Zionism being the same as patriotism. I don't actually know if it's in the history section, but somewhere in the book, they are talking about how students in a classroom saw US students doing the pledge and were like, oh, like they're so Zionist. But because Zionism is so connected to patriotism, that's what it feels like, which I just thought was interesting. And there's so many things where we, in a US context, critique US officials for doing these things that then we just let Israeli officials get away from. Like, one of the parts that stood out to me was talking about Trump's racist remarks about immigrants of color and calling countries, quote unquote, shithole countries, being so closely related to things that Israeli officials have said, things like labeling African refugees as infiltrators and, quote, a cancer in our body. Where if religion wasn't part of the picture, it would be things that I think everyone could agree on so quickly, like so easily agree on being terrible. But then because it's presented in the way that it is, it becomes like anti-Semitism to push back against it.
Yeah. It's a really good point. I was also struck by that Zionism as the default thing, which is going to come up later too. And Zionism being kind of this code word for other things. Like everyone knows what it means. We're just not saying it out loud, I think was a really powerful point.
In the foreword, Nora Ericat talks about the idea that Palestinians have been saying that Israel is an apartheid state for decades, but it wasn't until, I'm reading directly from the book, but B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, acknowledged this fact in early 2021 that the Israeli apartheid suddenly became universally credible. In an environment where they can only be heard if a Jewish ally confirms what they have been saying, Palestinians understandably grow angry. And I thought that was important, but I also read that and I was like, that's sort of the critique that is being made of JVP. So how is this book different if what it's doing is allowing Palestinian stories to be told by validating them by the existence of anti-Zionist Jews? But Nora goes on to say, literally a paragraph later, that this book is fundamentally different, tackling power head-on and charting the struggle against Zionism within the Jewish communities that Zionism purportedly serves. I don't know, it does feel like there is some contradiction that existed there that I just thought was interesting.
Yep, I agree. If the Nakba never ended,
Mm-hmm.
then these dynamics of the quote unquote good Jews speaking out on behalf of the Palestinians it's still there. It's still happening. It's exactly as problematic as it has been. And we're getting better, but it doesn't mean that the dynamic does not invalidate Palestinian experience by waiting for Jews to recognize it and name it. So I think I agree totally on that.
Yeah. And the last thing that was new for me and struck me as really interesting from the history section is on page 29, where they're talking about this idea of the Palestinian other, basically validating the existence of Israel. And it's compared to Hegel's dialectic of the master and the slave, which is a super sociological theory, which is probably why I was like, oh, that's so cool. It was really speaking to me. But it's just this idea that the master can never fully eliminate the slave, because without the slave, it's a master ceases to exist. So the master without a slave, Israel without Palestinians would cease to exist. And I just thought that that was a really compelling and well formulated idea. So I wanted to highlight that because it stuck out to me.
I don't know enough about the actual theory, so I can't speak on it that much. But I do think similar comparisons Noam Chomsky has made about South Africa apartheid and how South African apartheid was dependent upon the kind of the workforce there, and that's exactly what's happening in Israel. Is the comparison that gets him a lot of hate because Israel doesn't want to be seen like South Africa. And moving into a section of things that we may have read about before or knew from our studies, but we appreciate the framing of in this book. This is kind of our next series of notes. The erasure of Palestinian culture that's highlighted in the preface, and simultaneously with the anti-Zionist Jewish history that is erased pre-Holocaust. I thought was just like a really great point, because we kind of forget about how much of the Jewish community was anti-Zionist just because they didn't think it was necessary for something like this. And obviously changes everything completely, but that we like to pretend that Jews have always been hoping for a homeland in the same way that Zionists like to pretend that Palestinians never had any culture and never had any history, and like following those two as a deliberate erasure of histories, I think was really well framed.
Yeah, I also commented on that, as obviously at this point we know that anti-Zionist Jews have always existed, and Jews in general were fairly anti-Zionist for as a whole for a really long time, and Zionists were a small sect, but it's framed so clearly in this text with so many very specific examples of prominent Jews and prominent intellectual Jews who were very much on the it doesn't make sense for this type of state to exist pre-Holocaust are just highlighted constantly. Like one of the in the very beginning of the book, probably the first page with text, there are a bunch of quotes from people. And one of them is from a German Jewish refugee from the Holocaust who immigrated to the US in 1939. So literally a Jewish refugee from the Holocaust, who says, I now conclude and avow that the price of a Jewish state is, to me, Jewishly unacceptable, and that the existence of this or any similar Jewish ethnic religious nation state is a Jewish, i.e., a human and moral disaster, and violates every remaining value for which Judaism and Jews might exist in history. I mean, a Jewish refugee of the Holocaust said that in 1939, as the Holocaust was being used to justify the beginning of this genocide. And it's just, I don't know, it just is so affirming to hear that the literal people who were used as fuel for this propaganda were like, no, this does not align with Jewish values, this is not moral, and this, like, yeah, is not a representation of Judaism, was really affirming to read and have reiterated.
Yeah, and that comes up again, I think, later in the personal sections too. Also, I loved, not to get too specific, but like the noting of the Bund, the labor Bund, that chose to fight and die in the uprising against the czarist regime rather than go be safe in Israel is something that has been really influential for me in terms of when people challenge me by trying to be like, well, where would you go if there was another Hitler? And I'm just like, we have fascism all over this fucking country and people do it every day, and they're saying to fight for their right to exist here, and fuck that idea that you can just run away and escape the struggle. And that has been really, you know, exciting and comforting to me that we don't need a safe place to do, because no one else gets that, and solidarity and intersectionality. So anyway, all of that to support exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
I love these 2 points, and I feel like they go really hand in hand. So I'm just going to throw them together, even though they are articulated much more clearly and better than the way I'm going to say it. But the homogenizing of Jewish identity in order to create the identity that they wanted for the state of Israel is a very anti-Semitic Zionist idea. I love this, and this is in Zionism Twilight, but this concept of who the state was made for is this homogenized Ashkenazi white European identity that does not represent the Jewish people. And that in itself, the grouping of it, is anti-Semitic, to assume that this is the person that the state is made for and nobody else. Just really well put out. And then in the exact same way too, that the hyper masculinity of Zionism, I was like, yes, scream it, because we just talked about one of our the fantasizing of the strong Jew who can defend himself against the strong European Christian. It's a battle of strength amongst cishet men who are trying to prove that they're the stronger European. It has absolutely nothing to do with truly the trauma and all the other things that we were talking about was going on at that time in Europe, but it's literally just like, I'm stronger, and I'm going to go to my own country and carry guns, and then you can't get me.
Yeah, I also really, really, really appreciated the way that was highlighted within this. And of course, patriarchy and masculinity is so key in any power struggle, but I thought that it was highlighted really clearly by the author of this section. Something that also resonated with me from the foreword was this, it's just like a really short quote in the foreword that just says that the work that remains to be done requires something new of us. It asks that we shift from the structures of political advocacy to the realm of spiritual transformation, where revolutionary potential lies. And I was like, abolition. We're talking about abolition. And like, again, this is why I'm talking about it in this section, where it's like, right, of course we know, and this has been shown by countless abolitionists throughout history, that anti-Zionism is intrinsically linked to all of these struggles for liberation. But I just thought that was a really beautiful way of framing it. And I think when we're talking about this need to imagine different futures, that is what we need to do here. We need to break out of what has been proposed and imagine, use our imaginations, move beyond what we are doing, and really embrace abolitionist principles when we're talking about Palestinian liberation. And I just liked that framework a lot.
Yeah, I love that. I didn't make that connection, but I do know in this history section, there's so much talk of mass incarceration and the impact of mass incarceration on Palestinian culture and families, and knowing someone who has been incarcerated. And yeah, absolutely, that makes total sense. That, yeah, it connects to the abolitionist dream. We are creating the world when we're dreaming it. So, yeah, that's a really great connection. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I think what you just said leads into the final thing I had that was like, I know this, but it was highlighted really nicely in regards to the comments about Israel being a carceral state in the same way that the US is a carceral state, and the ways that mass incarceration operates as this, they say, as a pervasive form of biopolitical control of minority populations, which again, so if you are in opposition to mass incarceration in the United States, there is literally no reason that you would not be against the same practices in Israel, because they're playing out so similarly. Yeah, it is just like highlighting again, they talk about how it's the only country in the world that systematically prosecutes between 500 and 700 children as young as 12 in military courts every year. Children as young as 12. That's crazy. And also, like, along that vein, something that we've talked about before on this podcast, but the ways that like environmental oppression is used as a weapon by the Israeli government. And they talk about it a ton in this section, but again, I just thought it was framed very clearly. Specifically, I highlighted on page 36. So also just things where if you are an environmentalist or if you are an abolitionist of the US carceral system, you should also be anti Zionist because these struggles are overlapping perfectly.
Yeah, it made that part, the part about the persecution of children specifically, really made me think of that case that just happened with Rayan Suleiman, who was a 7-year-old who was chased by IDF soldiers and died of a heart attack. Is the saddest, most horrifying thing. And that doesn't even technically count towards their numbers of incarceration or their intentional.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like he was a bystander basically in their account. The terror, the sheer terror that children are facing in the West Bank and Gaza it's horrifying and definitely contributes to everything we're talking about, the carceral state. Yeah. Are we ready for things to have questions about?
Yeah.
The biggest thing that I struggled with in the forward was like the idea that we can transform
Mm-hmm.
settlers and we can decolonize Israel and Palestine without removing the settlers. And I don't have like a satisfying answer for this, but I don't think it is always 100% possible to undo settler colonialism by keeping everybody who has come there and stayed there. I mean, literally, there are settlements that are being built right now. There are people taking over, people from Brooklyn moving to Palestine, taking over people's homes. And I don't know if that idea of keeping settlers on the land and changing their hearts is necessarily decolonization. And I really struggled with the idea of where do the settlers go, but they don't stay in those homes for me personally, So that was something that is just a question I had. And there's also this reference to in the farmer section, which is called, it's the preface.
I think that's the preface, yeah.
Yeah. This is an updated version of a JVP book that like existed in the past that was only Jewish stories.
Play. It was
a play
that the farmer, I think, put together that happened in New York, and yeah, it was all about anti-Zionist Jewish stories, to my understanding.
There you go. Pointing back to where this is stemming from is trying to repair the work that JVP has done in a way that was very anti-Zionist Jewish centered and not inclusive and not thoughtful and not really prioritizing the Palestinian viewpoint. But great that it's happening and good that they named it. It's just I was struggling with like, ugh, And then of course the history section spends a lot of time talking about all the good things JVP has done, almost in a way that felt like it was trying to justify itself. I can write this because we did all these good things, and here we went here and we advocated for these people and did this and this, and it's not really about that. I mean, it's great that we get a short glimpse into what JVP has done, but that doesn't legitimize the fact that the book should be written in a way, once again going back to that same contradiction of we're doing the thing that we're saying we're trying not to do. So yeah, I struggled with that, and just what is the purpose of spending this much time detailing everything JVP has done.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think overall, if you were to take out this section, what is it, the Twilight of Zionism, it is a really good preliminary text for someone who is just coming to anti-Zionism and really wants historical and current context. I think it's really well put together in 40 pages in a way that is really digestible for people. And so I think overarchingly, it has a lot of value. And if someone came to me and was like, how do I learn more about this? I want more facts and information. I would be, yeah, you should read this. I think it's a helpful summation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And now let's talk about the other section we wanted to talk about.
Yes, displacement and memory. So we separated this out a little differently. We're separating it into like stories we learned from or parts that stuck out to us. And then stories that challenged our beliefs or upbringing. The Necklace by Riham Barghouti. Shout out to Miss Barghouti, who taught me everything I know about special education. We met through different means, and I haven't talked to her in a very long time, but she's amazing. I think this story really stuck out to me in the parts specifically about remembrance and the shape of the necklace being a reason for violence against people's bodies, because it's not a crime, that they're just doing nothing else wrong. They're just trying to cross over the Jordan, but it's the fact that they're trying to preserve the memory of Palestine is worth violence and harassment.
Right. It was
And,
the fact that there was proof
yeah.
that Palestine existed. I feel like there are so many examples throughout this section where Israel and Israeli officials have quite literally tried to eliminate that evidence as much as possible.
Yep. Absolutely. And of course, the same thing too, that Nakba hasn't ended. And Barghouti says that they don't have the privilege of having PTSD because it's all ongoing. And I was like, Jesus.
That the part talking about where it's not PTSD because it's ongoing reminded me a lot of conversations around Black American experience with quote unquote PTSD being ongoing and what it means for trauma to be ongoing and not post and never post because it's still happening. Another connection I wanted to talk about on page 79, from thriving farmers to hopeless refugees, Abdullah Al Jamal. Really hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's his story that is told and translated by his daughter. But the parts that stood out to that for me were really highlighting the ways that like the UN, I don't know, I think we think of the UN as like a peace governing body of the world, and obviously we know that that's not true, but there were so many specific examples of the UN being really terrible in that story that really stood out to me. He talks about how in 1951 the UN rented camps in Jordan for Palestinian refugees, and they rented them out for 99 years, and now there are 30 years left in that 99-year rental because those camps that were rented out are still there 60 years later, or however much time that is. And I don't know, that just really stuck with me. And then he also talks about how the UN gave refugee families materials, but they gave them asbestos for the ceilings, knowing that asbestos is internationally banned for the health risks. And also in the refugee camps, UN giving refugees food sprayed with DDT, which is a substance that was internationally prohibited for severe damage to the nervous system. And so I don't know, parts like that, there's like nothing to say about how fucking horrible that is. I was just like, that is really sickening and disgusting. I don't know. If all of this shit does not make you an absolute anarchist and abolitionist and really question the value of nation states and their governing bodies, I truly do not know what could.
Yeah, absolutely. That story made me think about what messaging around your existence you're getting from the people who are trying to quote unquote help you. That's
Yeah.
told that you don't matter, your body doesn't matter, your health does not matter, like to anybody. I just wanted to highlight real quick, in Zionists love Israel, but they don't love Jews, Esther Farmer's other section, the Ocean Hill Brownsville teacher strike, and her talking about that's the only picket line her parents ever crossed as like radical anti-Zionist union organizers, but recognizing that it was just a straight up racist teachers organization refusing to recognize people of color and specifically Black people in their communities and their culture was fantastic. And I think really called into question that tension between people and the term progressive and people who like to use that term, and really what does that even mean anymore. I thought that was great. And also straight up representing this part of Brooklyn College's Zionism, which is to this day a struggle. Like Brooklyn College is seen as diverse and progressive and all these wonderful things, that the strength of the Zionist hold on Brooklyn College was prominent even in this essay, but is definitely still a struggle today with all of the Israel groups on campus and kind of that disaster that is happening there. So really like that little Brooklyn shout out part.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that section. Another section that really stood out to me was The Snap by Shirley Bahar. who grew up in Israel, but talks about having a teacher in fifth grade in Israel in 1989. Like, basically, SNAP is the language she used. She's talking about a feminist SNAP, and is talking about the story of the Canaanites and Joshua and the Israelites arriving back to Canaan. And the teacher was like, if Joshua and the Israelites arrived back to Canaan after so many years of exile, were they not expecting it to be populated by people? Isn't this military aggression by the Israelites reminding you of Israeli occupation of the territories nowadays? And I was just like, that is, yeah, like that. I can't imagine being a kid in that classroom and having a teacher say that. And she goes on to talk about how upset her family was that a teacher would say that, but how radicalizing that was for her and how much that made her stop and be like, yeah, that tracks. So I don't know. I really appreciated that part. And it felt very equivalent to having a teacher say something about abolition or something. And I'm thinking about what that would have been like in fifth grade and being like, would have really helped me kickstart my journey. I also wanted to highlight the poem The Worst Ghosts by Hala Alian. I don't remember exactly what page that's on, but it is a really beautiful, beautiful poem. And I have also read Hala Alian's book Salt Houses recently, which is a book about a Palestinian family and their experience moving from place to place and the pain and heartache and like familial ties. And it is such a good book. So I just wanted to flag that if you want to read something by a Palestinian author that talks specifically about Palestinian experience being exiled in their home, I would really recommend reading Salt Houses. Oh, also the last thing that stood out to me was sort of small, but on 105 and 106, I think at the very end of this section, In a State for All Its Citizens by Asaf Calderon, who talks about basically the fact that simply being non-Zionist doesn't mean anything. You have to be anti-Zionist because it's a more sort of an loose term that is in direct opposition, not just sort of like a neutral, which again, like, yeah, we got that at this point, but I just thought it was a good point that I wanted to flag because I do think that there are a lot of progressive Jews who are like scared about using the language of anti-Zionism, and I think that's something that we questioned for a bit too, and have also had people be like, well, like, why do you have to use the word anti-Zionist? Like, why can't you call it something else? And it's like, because that's what I mean. Because I mean that I'm in direct opposition to that. I am in direct opposition to the Zionism that is genocidal to Palestinians. And so I just thought that was important to flag because I do think that conversation around the language that you use comes up a lot.
Yes, I mean, this is the thing that a lot of places are trying to skirt around by saying we struggle with Zionism, we're questioning Zionism, and like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, absolutely, to name it is so different by saying specifically anti-Zionism.
Yeah.
As moving into the stories that challenged us or our beliefs or our upbringing, The Blue Book by Lynn Lopez Salcedo, talking about, it was hard to read. I was just like, because I know there is a space for pieces of this that are reflecting on the harm that people have done during the creation of the state of Israel and immediately after, but planting JNF trees over Palestinian villages and celebrating with IDF soldiers what she thinks at the time is a military victory over another army or whatever, but is actually just a massacre of a village. Oh, it just felt insufficient in some ways to just name it and be like, and I felt terrible. I don't know what to do with this in my body because her story is valid and it's great that she's naming the things that actually happened, but then the conversation she has with the Palestinian person at the end, I don't know. It felt a little self-congratulatory at the end that it was just like, and I'm working on it and like, I will have to live with this and it sucks. But how else do you frame it? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, I think that's part of the living with the messiness because, we also have to talk about our journeys to how we got where we are so that we can get other Jews where we are. But living with the fact that it's also okay. And
Yeah, and then she is totally removed from mainstream Judaism now. You know, it's also something I struggle with too, is some people really just have to remove themselves completely because there is no separation of Zionism and Judaism for them because of the trauma that they have endured or because of the guilt or because of the shame. And that's something we have to live with too, the amount of Jews who are no longer identifying as Jews because Zionism has ruined it for them. A Place Cleared of Memory by Gabrielle Spear, I struggled with as well because
Yeah, I also struggled with that one. I like when I saw you highlight that, I was like, okay, good.
the idea that we can only understand Palestinian suffering in the context of Jews suffering during the Holocaust is the worst standard to apply to anything, because once again, we've talked about this before, that the Holocaust is absolutely tragic and horrific and disgusting and never should have happened. And it has happened to other peoples before in the world, and it has happened since in different ways. And using it as the standard of the only bad thing that can happen in the world is just not true. And it's very Eurocentric and it's fucked up. And I don't have better words for it other than we can't just compare everyone to Anne Frank. I'm sorry. There are other tragedies that deserve the spotlight by themselves and don't need to be compared to gas chambers. That being said, gas chambers and the people who died in them, it is horrific and sad in its own right. And I don't even know if that should be compared to anything. You know, the comparison of like, I understand
Right.
suffering now because I have read about Jews dying in Europe. It does not feel like a good comparison to make ever, I think.
Also, this is coming from a petty place, and I do think that any text that gives you compassion for another person is valid, and that's the importance of literature and art, and that's why we shouldn't ban books. But I just found the sentence, I found empathy for a Jewish people I had little to no interaction with, having grown up Catholic in the Bible Belt. So I laughed when I read that. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
I thought, yeah, I mean, I think that's what's hard about these is all of these stories have value in their own right. But yeah, there were definitely some where I was like, girl, what? You know, like I would never use me reading the I have a dream speech in elementary school. I don't know. I would just like, I don't know. Just like, what? That is a crazy thing to say, but that's fine, I guess.
No, I agree. I agree. It just felt very different from the other pieces in terms of like
Yeah.
checking yourself, recognizing what we're saying. It's great that two different Holocausts can be someone's like, spiritual awakening, but that's not for you. You know, it's not to be contextualized within your life, I felt. So a lot of complex feelings there. So moving, I struggled with Asaf Calderon's A State for All Its Citizens. This is going back to what we said before about Zionism as the default and recognizing how ingrained Zionism is in Israeli culture. And I mean, even at one point where the author says, I love my people and I don't want them to leave and I don't want things to change, but we have to undo Zionism completely and decolonize it. And I just struggle with then what does it mean to undo Zionism? To me, decolonization and undoing Zionism is a material process of dismantling the literal walls and the checkpoints and giving back land. And it's not just like a framework or a thought process or changing our hearts. So I do understand that it is ingrained, as is our American patriotism and white supremacy and heteropatriarchy and all of those things. And I don't know what it looks like to really undo it for us. But how do we undo Zionism without undoing all of the structures and institutions that it upholds? So just questions on that one. No judgment. Just try to figure it out.
Yeah. And sometimes I feel like that's the spiral that I get into when I'm thinking about abolition. And that's the thing about having to imagine futures that literally don't exist is that, yeah, sometimes that shit is fucking hard. As you were talking, as you were talking, I was just looking up the person who wrote the Anne Frank related piece, and I just have a lot of thoughts about her that I am not going to share now, but I just think that we should talk about offline because I'm really fascinated by what's happening here. Thanks for listening if you stayed around. next week, this time, Thursday, October 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to talk about the final 3 sections of the book: wrestling with identity, questioning power, and repairing and healing. So get hyped for that. If you haven't read those sections yet, read them and follow along with us, or listen to us talk about them. Let us know if you have any feedback or thoughts on the book club style. I think, this is our first go around with it, so I think we could definitely work out some kinks in the future, especially around time, but I think we had a lot to say. This will be out as a podcast tomorrow because we're trying some fancy new things, so stay tuned for Shabbat podcast. Don't forget to sign up for the newsletter to be updated. Thanks, Nate, for our podcast music. Also, shout out to Nate for getting married this coming weekend.
Woo!
Woo! Congrats, Nate. And Nicole.
Okay, thank you so much for that shout out. Yeah. I'm super excited for next week, and I can't wait to struggle some more with these texts.
Woo! All life is a struggle. Thanks for listening to us.